Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege for me to talk about ruminants, ruminant nutrition as a subject. I wanted to go into the slide just to show off my nice presentation, representatives of a rumen in comical form. When I got the topic on talking about fiber, I was trying to get my head around different farming operations that would be presented in the um, in the lecture, where fiber would be used as a roughage. So I came up with dividing the farming operations into intensive farming operations, into beef and dairy, communal as well as commercial farms. Looking into the extensive part would be cow-calf operation production units commercially, backgrounding operations, which is about halfway, and then beef production, which is intensive feedlots most of the times. The financial outcome for each of the operations would differ by trying to increase production per hectare, per pen, per unit of production per unit, which is the main outcome of commercial farming operations. On the dairy side, we also have replacement stock, which is the calves growing, dry cows, and then the resting cows, then lactating cows. Also, as a financial outcome, would be production per producing animal, production per cow. But then we also have part of the farming community represented here, a few communal farmers, where the outcome is slightly different. Into the main aim for communal farmers is actually to increase the stock on farm. Being a small farmer myself on the side, we have different reasons, not necessarily all financial reasons, why we keep livestock, and we need to take that into consideration as well. Talking about fiber, which is the central point of ruminant nutrition, really, I can't do that without going into energy as a nutrient component first. So looking into energy, that comprise about 65 to up to 95% of the dry matter consumed by animals. But it's important to realize that of that 60%, 60% of the energy would be utilized for cattle maintenance, and there's less than 40% left for production. So we're dealing with a needed product for the cattle to stay alive, but then we also need that to skim off that little bit of production we can get from them. We deal with energy as a nutrient when we formulate, but it's not really a nutrient. Energy is comprised of a whole range of carbohydrates, and each has a specific function. So if you can just go into the carbohydrate function and see where we can find all of the carbohydrates, it varies from very easily digestible carbohydrates, simple structures, the monosaccharides on the left-hand side, rapidly degraded sugars, through starches, fructans, then pectins, and then into the more indigestible fractions. And that's dependent on where it's situated in the plant. So the easily digestible carbohydrates, called NFCs, which is non-fiber carbohydrates, sits in the middle of the plant material. And that is the energy source mainly used, that can be utilized by monogastrics and humans as well. So that's the prime value, but it's surrounded by structural carbohydrates, which is the hemicellulose and cellulose, and it's less and less indigestible as we move on to the protective carbohydrates surrounding the plant material, which the job of that carbohydrate is actually to protect the plant, making it less and less digestible for ruminants. And we need to do the whole spectrum of this. The fiber part that we're talking about is in the F side, which is a neutral detergent fiber, And that's also divided into a more digestible part, which is the complete lot, and then ADF, which is less digestible or slower digestible. And all of these play a role working together into supplying energy to an animal. We need to understand that this is the advantage we have as ruminant farmers. We don't need to, um, all mammalian enzymatic systems don't have the capability of utilize half of the fiber component, which is the undigestible half. And this is where we are actually setting ourselves up for not even a competition on monogastric side, where they work on FCRs, which is really important to get feed component per production. The feed component we use is not in competition, which actually has its advantage. So just looking at what's happening, how the whole carbohydrate system works together to get cellulose to be digested, we need to understand that we need to rumen. So therefore we ruminant farmers, and we need to see the rumen as actually an entity on its own. The better we can utilize the rumen, the better we can supply energy to our animals. And that is the main function of a rumen, is to utilize the cellulose, which is inaccessible for all the competitive species. So this is more or less, if you look at this graph, putting fermentation on the one side and then the time spent, how each of these components would be digested. So our aim, remember, is to utilize cellulose to have an energy source. So utilizing, and that can't be done by the enzymatic system of stomachs. It needs to be done by microbials. The microbials, as they break down the cellulose fiber, their waste product would be a volatile fatty acid, which is the main energy source for ruminants, and that is where our focus would be. So the end job of rumen is actually getting cellulose digested, with the advantage of having the volatile fatty acid supplied to the animal, which the cattle is using for the energy source. So they're not using the initial easily digestible nutrients. That's used by the bacteria. So typically our sugar is fermented. You can see it's like a tin of Coke. You take it now, 2 hours later you're tired again. Can't be a sustainable meal. And this is actually, you can see how it's digested. Very fast digestible, but then just as fast it's depleted. So, but that is the spike that the bacteria need to start doing their job. So what happens with bacteria, and microbiologists use the technique to multiply bacteria in laboratories as well. As soon as bacteria is in the area of sugar, or realize there's sugar available, they will start multiplying. So what happens, why we're feeding sugar to ruminants, is actually to get the bacterial load to start to increase to as much as possible, for it to be able to utilize as much as possible cellulose. But then we can multiply the bacterial load 1,000-fold within the first half an hour of feeding sugar. But then we need to maintain the bacteria while they're doing their job, which is breaking down the fiber. And that is where all the other easily digestible nutrients comes in, is actually maintaining the bacterial load to do their job. If we can maximize the system, all of the easily fermentable carbohydrates will be utilized by the time the cellulose is digested, and we have the advantage of having the volatile fatty acids to be used as an energy source by the cattle. An added benefit of that is, as the bacteria is doing their job, utilizing the cellulose, breaking down the fiber, they are also growing and maturing and living their life and die of old age. And as they does that, they flow through the rumen outlet into the rest of the digestive tract, and that will be the supply of protein to the ruminant as well. So the better we can maximize this process with the rumen as a central point, utilizing fiber would be the animal would be able to produce enough energy for it to be used and enough protein for it to be produced for its own body maintenance as well as for production. If we can increase the maximum on the bottom right, I have a little schematic that I calculated. When the efficiency of microbial production is maximized per kilogram of digested material, it will be sufficient to supply 91% of protein needed for 25 liters of milk production, which is nearly enough to actually maintain without any added protein in there. The advantage of microbial protein is in its biological value that it supplies. So how we calculate biological value of protein, there's a certain amount of amino acids needed for each as building blocks for products it's building. So those building blocks, in our case, it would be milk, meat, or a fetus that we build, very nearly simulate. So we analyze all the amino acids, put it onto a profile. If we compare the amino acid profile of a microbial protein, it very nearly simulates the product that we want to produce as building blocks. So this is a comparison with soya oil cake, the red being microbial protein, and you can see that it's about double the biological value that we have for our products as soya is, which everybody thinks is the best protein source. This is just a slight overview of the whole metabolic process going on. So in the blue cow, there's just another schematic showing where the different carbohydrate sources are utilized. So in the middle, sugar is utilized. The function of sugar is actually to increase the digestive bacteria. We get two main types of bacteria. One is starch digestive bacteria, and the other is fiber digesters. So the starch digesters, the main source of volatile acids they are producing is propionic acid. Propionic acid is actually a precursor for lactate. Lactate is the main driver for milk production. In milk, lactate never changes. That's the stable source. So the amount of lactate we can produce, that is the amount of milk we can produce. It's similar to the amount of milk we can produce. So that actually drives production. Then in the fiber digesters, their main source of volatile fatty acids would be acetic acid, which is a driver for milk fat. Another volatile fatty acid that is being produced is butyric acid, which goes mainly toward body maintenance and a slight contribution to the long-chain fatty acids in milk. If you look on the diagram at the right, just to show that when we start with a diet ending with a milk production, in the rumen, that's actually the central part where everything happens. So it's very important for us to look at the rumen as a specific entity in milk production. All right, so that on the one side, that's a broad idea in protein, energy as main components, but we need to look at feed as a complete complete supply of a range of components. So breaking down feed into its different components would be the protein being 24 different type of amino acids making up the protein fraction. There's more than 250 types of bacteria which would produce microbial protein, 17 fatty acids, 21 type of carbohydrates, and all of the others broken down in components, just to show that we're dealing with 400 different type of components to be balanced in a feed. And all of that actually need equal attention. Just to lift out the energy supplying components in feed would be around 60%, as I said. The protein containing would be around 20%, and 20% of the feed is made up of all of the other components. We get the real value when we can balance a diet to the exact needs. So what is a balanced diet? This is what we're trying to do in different circumstances. So a balanced diet is actually easy. It contains all the needed nutrients. So that's our aim. But it's not as easy as that. We need to make sure that the nutrients are contained, but then without any excesses of shortages in the diet. So what happens if we have a shortage of the diet? So if we are balancing a ration to supply all the needed nutrients any animal needs at a specific time, the animal has the capability to produce at 100% of its genetic potential. All right, so that's the aim. If we have a shortage of any of the nutrients, then that will limit the production. That's easy to work out. But if we have excess of any of the nutrients, it is similarly damaging to the whole balance for production. So with shortages or with the excess of any of those 400 nutrients, an animal, after it has the workers to produce the products, the building blocks to produce the products, any of the excesses is similar to having lunch, nice Sunday meal, and everyone had eat full. There's food left over, can't leave it on the table. You need to store it, pack it away, get it in the fridge before afternoon rest. And the body works similar to that. Not used nutrients can stay there forever. All excesses needs to be broken down, stored, excreted, transformed into something else. And that all of those metabolic processes comes at the energy cost. So whatever we have at excess, it actually comes at the energy cost. Shortages work exactly the same way. So if we are producing at 100% genetic potential, but one of the 400 nutrients is in the shortage, then it will limit the production down to the shortage of that raw material. And then we sit with 300 other nutrients that's in excess. Again, that needs to be stored, excreted, broken down, transformed at an energy cost. So we want to maximize the balance of the feed. And it doesn't matter if we balance it at a lower than genetic potential rate, as long as it's balanced, we are winning the game. So maximizing balance will optimize productivity, and that's normally shown in immunity, growth, livability, fertility, and some of the components that's difficult to measure. But that's not the end of the story. So we can't have the animal and just shove down 400 nutrients in the perfect balance, because there's certain parameters that's needed for it to be utilized. Firstly, the extent of the digestion of those raw materials actually has a very important role. Does it help us shoving it in if it's not digested at all? And not only the digestion of those components, but also the pace of the digestion has a real impact on the microproduction. And our end goal would be to maximize rumen and microproduction. The problem with we as nutritionists is those parameters is not necessarily in our control. That's dependent on the physical characteristics of the feed and how it's presented to the animals. And normally that's the farmer's responsibility. So we have a challenge in doing our job, and the bottom line is a little bit flat out of what we're trying to do is firstly to determine the requirement of an animal, secondly determine what is available on farm or near to the farm or a cheap source of products that farmers can use, and then we want to determine what is the shortage that's needed. And if we can determine that accurately, that is the way to get the most cost-effective production in that shortage. And there's very narrow boundaries where we can work in. Just an example on the left-hand side, We need the sugar spike, as I said. It's critical to have that to get the bacteria to start working. But so we need about 4 to 8% of that. But going over 12% would have a depressing effect on the rumen function because it will drive down the pH and the whole system will topple over. So it's very important to realize that it's not the responsibility of the nutritionist only, but farmer also carries a lot of, needs to have a lot of knowledge how to utilize to the maximum. But in the end, one of the aims is to achieve the maximum volatile fatty acid production. So the more energy we can add into the animal, the better production it can get. So whether it is extensive, intensive, doesn't matter where it is. If we can get maximum volatile fatty acid production from the rumen, we have the best chance of supplying the animals with enough energy. But it needs to be balanced with the uptake of the volatile fatty acid by absorption from the rumen, and if not, buffering it with either saliva, by chewing, or added buffers into there. So we can use NDF as a sort of a buffer to accommodate for different farming circumstances, and we do that. So although the aim is to maximize that, in certain specific farming systems, it's not the best thing to do because the presentation or the of the feed to the animals is deficient, and we use NDF as a guideline to stop that. So if we have management issues in feeding strategy, low quality roughage, slug feeding, or any of those NFFSs, we need to increase the NDF to make the feed safer. If the farming operations, as the management improves, we can make the feed less safe and more driven for production. So the fiber fraction of the carbohydrates, being ADF and NDF, is related to intake as well as the digestibility of the intake. Both of them are associated with, firstly, rumen fill, and in the end, whether it's any type of cattle, the aim of the cattle would be to fill its stomach. So they eat until the rumen is full. So that is positively associated with rumen fill, positively associated with chewing. Chewing would supply saliva, which would buffer the rumen, protecting it against pH changes, rumination, rumen health. But it's negatively associated with intake, the energy content, therefore would reduce the production potential, the volatile fatty acid production of the feed that we're feeding. We need to realize that animal performance is a function of the access to feed, the nutrient content, the intake, digestibility, and the metabolism of the feed, of which NDF affects the three most important ones, being nutrient content, intake, and digestibility. So NDF and ADF is our safeguard for maintenance, for management issues on farm. So we have two paradigms that we work between, being on the one hand maximizing forage diets. There we focus on NDF digestibility, and the minimum forage diets, where we focus on the digestibility of that NDF. Anywhere between, we try to target, as nutritionists, the type of feed that a farming operation can handle. Just a few notes on chewing, and I've been working in Zimbabwe now for the past 3 years, visiting a few farms, and I think I had to just calculate the values just to show some of our farmers. So although we have to have chewing, a lot for the saliva production and the buffering capacity, we need to realize it takes time to chew undigestible fiber. So if we look at wheat straw as a product, it takes 200 minutes to chew 1 kilogram of wheat straw into a digestible product that can be utilized by the rumen bacteria, 200 minutes per kilo. So if you do the calculation, a cow has about 10 to 12 hours of chewing time available, leading it actually to be able to only utilize 3 kilos of wheat straw. Can't be the only source of fiber that you supply. You need to look at the supply of different fiber content. So digestibility of NDF is also really important. As we increase digestibility of NDF, we obviously will have increased time at the intake, therefore increased energy intake. Would be a more healthy rumen because the pH is higher, no unnecessary volatile fatty acid would be produced. We can increase the microbial crude protein production and a constant supply of absorbed nutrients. If we can achieve that, we have less pressure on supplying rumen bypass proteins. A better peak and persistency, and obviously better feed conversion ratio. Just a schematic of the impact of the improvement of ruminant digestibility and rumen pH as it increases up to the ideal level of 6.4 rumen pH. It will have a direct improvement on there. The problem with PE NDF or digestibility of the NDF fraction, nothing I can do about it. That's all farm dependent, right? So we need to take care that whatever roughage we give the animals can be eaten in time and digested in time. I gave some guidelines and it will be available on the guidelines. I'm not going to go through the guidelines because I want to come to talk a little bit about the economic value of the fiber. So just looking at the prices of raw materials over the past few years, you can see the top curve is all the protein types of raw materials, the oil cakes, cotton, all of the oil cakes actually is in that list. And you can see that in the past 5 years, it actually increased in cost exponentially, right? So it's the same, grain does the same thing. It's not as pronounced as the protein products, but also it's exponential growth. So the reason for that is as that's the feed that is actually going for humans and for monogastric animals and being in competition with that. But we don't need to be. If you can see the roughage is actually the bottom layer, not little has changed in the price of roughage, nothing compared to what the other two would be. So we need to make ourselves more and more independent of competitive raw materials and more into utilizing fiber properly. But to do that, we need to know what we're feeding, know what the roughage component would supply for us to be able to balance it similarly. I just took 2 samples of 2 different feeding regimes from the rumen, and you can see the difference in intake of the dry grass versus a pasture grass. So the whole function of intake is really important. We need to determine the value of not only felt but the total roughage component by doing a chemical analysis. I have a good idea of what the protein content is in a certain space, what the digestibility of that is, what the voluntary intake per time unit is, and then the capacity to sustain production. How often will we have the grass? Will it be able to sustain us throughout the year? Because what we want to do is want to really utilize this function that we have. That is, and I see the rumen as a separate entity from the cow that we really need to protect and try to utilize to its maximum potential. because that's actually gives having a rumen is the ecological link in what's needed to be able to produce from feed components that's not available to other species. We really need to look at the rumen. So just getting a little grip from a rumen, what do I mean when I say we need to look after the rumen? It has a few specific needs in as it needs to be an anaerobic environment. Bacteria doesn't, the proper bacteria doesn't like oxygen very much. It needs to be supplied by raw materials, by solids. About 20% of the rumen should be solid. A specific temperature. There needs to be an influx of feed. There needs to be a continuous removal of waste products. Waste products being volatile fatty acids, which is the energy source of the cow. And it needs to be mixed on a regular basis. So just to take this into perspective is if you look at the bottom, and I don't want to read the figures, but there's a quadrillion small little animals doing the job for us to break down fiber that contains that amount of 10 to the power of 11 bacteria, 6 billion protozoa, a lot of fungi, and all sorts of bacteria per milliliter of rumen fluid. If you calculate that with 100 liter rumen fluid, then we get to a figure of microbials in the rumen that I don't even want to say because I'm scared I sound like like Zuma trying to say numbers. Right, so if we do all the things the rumen wants to be solid, it will sort itself out into a gaseous fraction, a nice fiber mat which is lined up with the esophagus on the one side and the exit from the rumen on the other side, where the particles would be selected, which needs to go back into the mouth for rumination, and the rest actually would be allowed to go to the lower digestive system, and the bottom part where fermentation take place, and it will mix properly so that this filter space can be utilized properly. And I just added some photos of two different regimes of rumen through fistulas where we did some trial work, and you can see the first one being a slightly undigestible fiber, very proper mat forming, but you can see the rumen is very highly filled and not a lot of fermentation it's taking place there compared to the other one where there's a better digestible fiber in there, and then we can see the gaseous space, the rumen full. You can see actually the bubbling action happening under the rumen mat on there. So the bacteria also has its own little town going on in there. It consists of different populations of fiber digesting bacteria, starch digesting bacteria. They are dependent on the fungi that's also in the rumen, part of the rumen microbiome, to break down the fiber for them to gain access into the easily digestible parts of the fiber components, and then it actually has protozoa, which is part of the cleanup team to utilize the rumen. And the most important thing is when these populations of rumen bacteria are set, we don't want to disturb it as little as possible. So we can clearly see that if we can establish proper rumen function, up to 100% of the protein supply of the animal can be is achievable from the microbial protein, and that's our drive. If we don't get it right, then we sit with the whole process that's actually not happening, like a factory that actually has a blockage and nothing can come out from there. So on the first photograph, there's a proper rumen with villi sort And all of those villi are absorption space for volatile fatty acids to be absorbed into the blood, supplying energy to the animal. If we damage that in the extra photos, not only do we have inflammation in rumen and a lot of issues in the long term, but also the absorption would be diminished, which will actually increase the damage being done to the rumen wall. And it actually goes into a cycle going down and down from acidosis to laminitis into a whole lot of metabolic issues we can. So if we have too much degradation, this is on the left-hand side, it's the short-term impacts. So you see these things like bloat because of the viscosity, because of increased amylolytic bacteria, decreased fiber digestion, a drop in the rumen pH, the motility, the mixing functionality of the rumen ceases, water accumulates, and depresses feed intake. But if this goes on for a while, then we set with secondary issues because of that, by inflammation of the rumen wall going into mycotic ruminitis, the T junction that's actually keeping the rumen together, or the whole digestive tract, would be overwhelmed by the microbial production, leaking bacteria into the body cavity, and will cause all sorts of issues with the pathogenic bacteria in the body, by causing liver abscesses, lung infections, an increase in histamine production, and then we see that as laminitis and metabolic problems. So the whole system just shuts down. So it's very important to realize that whatever we do, we need to look after the rumen and rumen functionality. We need to feed the rumen for the rumen to be able to feed the cows. One thing that I actually left out to say is while microbials are building their body and utilizing this cellulose, they are maturing, and that bacteria is actually between plants and animals. They can utilize pure nitrogen and synthesize amino acid for their own body growth, and that is our aim. And you can see again, following the previous graph, as the bacteria is doing the job digesting cellulose, they need ammonia for them to be able to grow their bodies as well. And but our aim would be, if the cellulose is fermented, at that point the nitrogen component needs to be depleted in the rumen. So we need to feed a spike of that, but just enough for it to help the body condition growing. All right, so I want to stand still, just go through a slight bit. Where's my time? All right, I just want to stand still just on the most critical factor in each of these production units. Firstly, extensive farming. At extensive farming, we try to utilize up to 95% of the nutrient value from felt only supplying less than 0.5% of feed. So we've done this trial where we were fattening animals. This trial was done in Namibia, and we're fattening them in different feeding regimes for different farmers. Firstly, the first one, we only fed rock salt, as a typical very low-level communal farmer would do, having rock salt. The secondary, the farmers actually realized they need some phosphorus, so add phosphorus and rock salt to the mix. Then the middle one was a maintenance lick program through the year. Next one was a production program, and then a finishing type of feed that we fed. And then you can see in all the criteria where the finishing diet actually outperforms all of the other regimes, clearly. Even in the dressing capacity over the year of the animals being slaughtered in a year's time, was just increased by feeding the animal to finishing on a finishing type of treatment. But if we put financials into this whole system, and this is, sorry, maybe a dollar, but if we put the financials, you can clearly see that as we are feeding more than the animal needed, the cost of feeding actually increased more than the advantage we would have get by the improved production. So we did a profitability index of the finishing cattle. You can see again the middle one where if we feed up to the maintenance requirement of the animal, we actually achieved the best. Which means, although the last treatment actually made way more money than the rest, if you look at the net income, which is the red graph of the veld, overfeeding that animal or feeding that to the best of our capability, income-wise to the farmer was similar to the lowest regime of feeding on an extensive basis. The rest of the income went to the feed company. All right, so we need to make a decision-making model if we work on extensive farmers, and it needs to be taken into account the target weight of the animals, the growth temper targets, as well as the cost of growth. We need to understand what our veld and our roughage sources would supply at what times of the year, and making a program where we have enough decision-making spaces to accommodate for what's happening on veld. All right, just 1 or 2 pointers in dairy. With dairy cattle, whether you have an extensive farm or a communal farm milking 2 or 3 or 4 cows for your home, or a commercial farm, or the best dairies with pastures and everything, all has the same issue. And Dr. Doug actually talks about that as well. In the first phase, just after calving, we have this space where the animal can't eat enough to contain a body condition, as well as as giving milk to the calves. And we actually have a loss of weight reduction. Then we have a space where we can catch up with that and increase body condition to prepare for the next lactation cycle. I had a few fiber guidelines, but I'm just going to pass that. The main issue we have with dairy farms is actually getting the correct amount in there, because they're naughty. They would go for concentrated parts and leave out the roughage to their own detriment. We need to make sure that whatever we feed is nutritionally balanced to get the full complement into the animal, and not by adding more roughage necessarily. In the dry period, we have specific needs to produce for the next cycle a metabolically robust cow, by giving a proper rest for the epithelium system to repair itself, and the alveolic tissue in the udder to be prepared. So there's specific things that we need, and fiber is a main contributor, specifically in the dry period, and then in the steam up, preparing her for the next milking season. I'm going to pass on all the grazing things, because Sally is following me with the pasture. From a nutritional perspective, the only thing we want to know is working on pastures or on any roughage, is what did the cows eat? So we need to measure the intake of that, measure it before going into the grazing and coming off the grazing, so that we can balance the ration into the needs. In intensive farming, just one little sentence, we are dependent on only 10 to 20% of fiber for real production feedlots. The main aim for production feedlots is to utilize as much maize as possible, as much grains. The more energy we can push into those animals, the better they will grow. But we need the fiber component for them to give them a little bit of buffer against stress. Any stresses will have a disruptive effect on the rumen. You can see a little picture of a damaged rumen, and that was caused by one windy day where the cattle didn't eat properly. The fiber component was not enough. So we need fiber in feedlot intensive animals for it actually to just carry them through stress periods. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip all the felt things just because I want to spend the last few minutes talking about silage because that was a specific request. All right, so producing silage, we need to understand silage is not a singular material. We can do a lot by making proper silage, but we can do a lot by having proper maize and making bad silage for the same price. The factors influencing the silage quality and quantity would be the cutting time, or obviously the yield of the plant, cutting time, the length, the dry matter, the accuracy of the cut, the sharpness of the blades. Because we want to introduce lactobacillus fermentation, which would preserve the silage properly. We need to ensure that it's properly stored, no aerobic situations happens which would diminish the quality. And then even if we use it, while we're using it, we need to preserve the face of the silage. And this is just a schematic showing that when silage is cut, is actually the criteria in what product you would produce. So as silage, as the maize plants mature, obviously the production of the grain component will be increased, but there's a certain time where the dry matter would have an impact in the plant material being died off. So silage is half grain, half plant material. All right, so and we decide on the cutting stage on what we're producing. So there's an ideal way of looking into a 30% dry matter silage cut, which is the ideal fraction where we would, in a silage bunker, supply enough moisture, enough substrate for the bacterial to grow properly and preserve the silage. Sorry, just need to. All right, so I'm skipping this. Just want to get to here. Throughout the few years in the industry, I've analyzed multiple silage as to use as feed components. So I've divided it into different yields of maize crops being ensiled at different stages of ensiling, right? So the green one was actually ensiled too early. That's a little bit moist. Then the middle tree is more or less the ideal stage, and then too late. And then from this analysis, you can see on the energy side, we can produce silage that is actually equivalent, the last two circles there, silage that's actually equivalent to wheat straw, which is totally roughage, no grain, no protein in there. Sometimes the intake would be diminished by the butyric acid that you produce in that silage as well. Or we can produce silage which actually has a high protein but very low starch, where we ensiled low yield maize at the early stage, then we produce a protein supplying roughage, or we can supply energy supplying roughage. And it's important to know what the silage is that we're working with, because it actually has a real impact on the economics of the whole system. And sorry, Dylan, I used your values to just do a little calculation in using different silage in a dairy plant, where I try to balance whatever the silage would supply with the rest of the raw materials and getting it to balance for a 600 kilogram cow milking at 25 liters. And you can see the cost difference in producing the best silage And the worst silage is about $2.50 per animal per day, which has a real impact. Just as final thought, so we as ruminants, we need to understand that we are really buffered against the volatility of raw material prices. But it's needed for us to take the right approach to profits management and analysis and remain flexible to utilize as much as roughage as we can. If we're producing from veld, we need to draw up a roughage management plan, be it veld, pastures, or stored roughage, that will set us right through the year and actually has a little bit of buffer for when there's nothing available. That would benefit our production, the profitability, and the environment. With silage, we have a small window to produce the best roughage source we can, have it in the bunker, have it stored safely, and that will actually contribute to a robust business security.